And then she had this very aggressive conversation with this pigeon, and her neck was all snaky and weird. So today we're going to have Pig and Pepper, not Hat. We're going to read Pig and Pepper, which, like I said, is one of my favorite chapters. And as promised, this is the super delightful, what's it called? Illustrations. This is the fish, and this is the frog. Yay, it's Tess! And do you see how they're wearing super, super, super fancy outfits? So these super fancy outfits are called livery. And you spell it like liver, or actually that's not where your liver is, that's where your kidneys are. Liver and then with a Y. So if you are a super fancy, wealthy person and you had servants, then you would want your servants to be dressed really fancy all the time. Now, that sounds weird, right? Because I'm thinking like, well, if I have a maid and the maid is going to be cleaning, doesn't the maid need to wear like kind of practical clothes? No. You want, if your maid is wearing fancy clothes, that means that you must not just be rich, you must be like ultra rich. So it's a sign that, you know, you're so fancy that even your servants are fancy. So that's what livery is. And I'm making a thing of it because I just think it's interesting. Okay, so chapter 6, Pig and Pepper. For a minute or two, she stood looking at the house and wondering what to do next, when suddenly a footman in livery, we know a fish, and rapped loudly at the door with his knuckles. It was opened by another footman in livery, with a round face and large eyes like a frog, both footmen. Alice noticed had powdered hair that curled all over their heads. She felt very curious to know what it was all about, and crept a little way out of the wood to listen. So number one, they're super nosy and they're like in that frog and fish's business. Number two, it calls them footmen, because here's another thing about servants is that if you're like a super duper, if you are like rich, then you might have a maid to clean up after and like a guy who's like a handy guy, right? But if you are ultra rich and you have a lot of servants, then they all have different jobs, right? So one job that you might have heard of is a butler. And the butler is the dude that is in charge of everybody. And then another lady might be the housekeeper. And the housekeeper would be the lady that's in charge of all the housemaids. So a footman is kind of on the lower rung of the servants. The fish footman began by producing under his arm a great letter, nearly as large as himself, and this he handed over to the other, saying in a solemn tone, "For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet." The frog footman repeated in the same solemn tone, only changing the order of the words a little, "From the Queen, an invitation for the Duchess to play croquet." So, you know, I get pretty excited whenever I get an invitation. How am I to get inside? She repeated aloud. "I shall sit here," the footman replied, "till tomorrow." At this moment, the door of the house opened, and a large plate came skimming out, straight at the footman's head. It just grazed his nose and broke to pieces against one of the trees behind him. Maybe the next day," the footman continued in the same tone, exactly as if nothing had happened. "How am I to get in?" Alice asked again in a louder tone. "Are you to get in at all?" said the footman. "That's the question, you know." It was, no doubt, only Alice did not like to be told so. "It's really dreadful," she muttered to herself, "the way all the creatures argue. It's enough to drive one crazy." The footman seemed to think this was a good opportunity for repeating his remark with variations. "I shall sit here," he said, "on and off for days and days." But what am I to do?" said Alice. "Anything you like," said the footman, and began whistling. "There's no use in talking to him," said Alice desperately. "He's perfectly idiotic." And she opened the door and went in. So, a couple of things. Number one, Let's none of us be like the footman who cannot solve any problems. Because you know what he could have done that whole time? He could have just stood up and opened the door. But that's like a lot of people that cannot find their way out of a paper bag. Number two, Alice is just walking into somebody's house. I mean, she's not even invited. She's just going in. Okay, so the door led right into a large kitchen, which was full of smoke from one end to the other. The Duchess was sitting on a three-legged stool in the middle, nursing a baby. The cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron, which seemed to be full of soup. So, two things. Number one, this book uses the word nursing a lot, and the way in which they use it is not the modern way that we use it. So when we say these days you have a baby and you're nursing it, it means that like the mother is giving it milk. But we've heard Alice talk about nursing Dinah and nursing the baby. And in this book, they mean kind of like cuddling. All right. And there is the Duchess, and that is the baby, and there is the cook. Okay. And she's stirring a large cauldron, which seemed to be full of soup. Actually, hang on a second. I think I have one. Hold on. Yeah, I have a pretend cauldron. So in old times, before we had electricity, the way that people would, heat up their food is they would have a large fireplace inside their kitchens. And that's how you would heat food. So you would have a fireplace, and you'd often have like a metal arm that you could swing back and forth. Talking about axes, she's talking about like AXIS, like the poles that the earth goes around. But the Duchess, of course, is talking about like axe. Alice glanced rather anxiously at the cook to see if she meant to take the hint, but the cook was busily stirring the soup and seemed not to be listening. So she went on again. Here's Alice. 24 hours, I think, or is it 12? Oh, don't bother me, said the Duchess. I never could abide figures. And with that, she began nursing her child again, singing a sort of lullaby to it as she did so, and giving it a violent shake at the end of every line. Okay, so here is the song that the Duchess is singing to her little baby. Speak rough. I'm not going to sing it. I'm just going to tell you what it says. Speak roughly to your little boy and beat him when he sneezes. He only does it to annoy. Because legs in all directions, just like a starfish, thought Alice. The poor little thing was snorting like a steam engine when she caught it, and she kept doubling itself up and straightening itself out again, so that altogether, for the first minute or two, it was as much as she could do to hold it. As soon as she had made out the proper way of nursing it, which was to twist it into a kind of knot and then keep it tight hold of its right ear and left foot so as to prevent its undoing itself, she carried it into the open air. If I don't take this child away with me, thought Alice, they're sure to kill it in a day or two. Wouldn't it be murder to leave it behind? She said the last words out loud, and the little thing grunted